Good to be back with you for our Sunday's message on this 25th of October 2020. And welcome to the online service of Ganubi Methodist Church. I'm Ryan Watt, and our message for today is Finding Ourselves in the Greater Plan of God. When we listen to an orchestra, we hear a beautiful piece of music made up of the combined sound of many instruments. The music was originally created in the composer's heart and mind and written down so that we could all enjoy what the composer imagined. For us to hear the music as the composer did, the composer would have written down the different parts for multiple instruments to play together. Each instrument in the orchestra needs to play the correct notes at the correct time and in the right way. And when they do, we hear the same beautiful music that the composer heard, even generations after it was first written. Now, say we had to hear the bass drum playing its part alone. Or what if we watched the conductor conducting the music without the orchestra? It would be pretty uninspiring, meaningless, and even irritating to watch the conductor conducting or listen to the bass drum banging without the rest of the orchestra playing. And yet, the bass drum playing the correct beats at the correct time and the conductor conducting the orchestra in the correct way are both essential to us hearing what the composer wanted us to hear. And both of them find fulfillment in what they do, not in their individual performances, but in being part of the whole. There is no one instrument in the orchestra who, on their own, can accomplish the music that the composer intended for us to enjoy. But when each person plays their own part as written, their music moves the soul. Our lectionary reading for today is from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, from verses 1 through 12. Deuteronomy 34, 1 through 12. May the Lord bless to us our time in His Word. In our passage for today, we join Moses climbing to the highest ridge of Mount Nebo, because God had called him to do so, in chapter 32 and verse 48. Mount Nebo was located on the one side of the Jordan River, and on the opposite side lay the Promised Land. Moses had faithfully led God's people through the wilderness for 40 years, and at last they were at the threshold of the Promised Land. So Moses climbs to the top of Mount Nebo, and from that elevated position, we're told that God shows Moses the whole of the Promised Land. And then we read in verses 4 and 5 of our passage in Deuteronomy chapter 34. Then the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Now, after all those years of faithful service, Moses and the plagues in Egypt, Moses and the Red Sea, Moses and the 10 Commandments, Moses and the miracles in the wilderness, Moses and his encounters with God, Moses and the writing of God's law, Moses and the construction of God's tabernacle. After all this, Moses' death is recorded in one sudden, curt verse. And that's it. It's all over. Moses' death may catch us by surprise as we read this passage, but it comes as no surprise to Moses. Because when God had called Moses to ascend Mount Nebo, God had also told Moses that that is where he was going to die, in chapter 32 and verse 50. Now, we may be pondering the fairness of this all. After all, Moses had been the one who for the past 40 years had faithfully led God's often complaining and rebelling people all the way from Egypt to the very entrance of the Promised Land. Surely God could have at least allowed him over the finish line. but nowhere do we read about Moses complaining. We know that God had already told Moses long ago that he would not enter the promised land because Moses had sinned against God at Meribah. You can read about that in Numbers 20, verses 11 and 12. But one is tempted to think that after all that Moses had done right, that God could have forgiven him one sin and allowed him to go in. One lesson that we could draw from this is that sin is sin, and not all the good we can do in the world can undo a single sin that we've committed. Sin can only be forgiven by an act of God's own mercy, which God has done for us when Jesus died in our place on that cross. But when Jesus died on the cross, he also died for the sin of all the Old Testament believers that had gone before him. Remember, in God's plan, God always knew that Jesus would come. And so because Moses, Abraham, and all the others had believed in the God of mercy and covenant love, they also qualified for God's merciful forgiveness through Christ's death when it came. You can look at Romans 4 and verse 3. So why then did Moses not apply to God for grace to cover his sin, just as he had done so many times before on behalf of the Israelites? Well, here is where we find our main emphasis for today from our passage. It was precisely because Moses trusted in the grace of God that he was content to die when he did. As Acts 13:36 says of David, so it was also for Moses before him. For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep or he died. Whether it was David or Moses before him, or Abraham before them, each of them had the incredible joy of walking with God during their lifetime. They had personally got to know the eternal God of power and rescuing love. They knew that God was the grand composer, and they understood who they were and how they were to live in relation to the greater plan of God. After all, didn't we read earlier that God had already promised this land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And yet, while they had received the promise, none of them had received the land either. And so Moses, from on top of Mount Nebo, was not moping his misfortune, but rejoicing in God's blessings as he gazed over the promised land. After all, Abraham had only received the promise from far off, but Moses had got to lead God's people to the very threshold of the promise. Moses understood that God's plan was far greater than him, that he had only one part to play in the grand composition of God. And Moses also knew that God's plan could be trusted, even when that plan included his death. And so for Moses, the greatest joy of his life was that God had included him in this plan at all. Let's look at what Moses had enjoyed during the final 40 years of his life, verses 10 through 12 of our passage. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. We need to remember that it had been God who had reached out to Moses in the first place. God who had drawn near to Moses. It was God who had empowered Moses. Without God, the closest Moses could ever have got to God was the top of Mount Nebo. But God came down to Moses because of God's grace. Moses had known God, experienced God, and journeyed with God during his lifetime. Moses had had a glorious time playing his part, but now his part was done, and it was time for another instrument to play. So even before Moses had ascended Mount Nebo, knowing his part in God's composition was played, Moses had willingly passed the baton to the next instrument in God's composition. Verse 9 of our passage tells us that Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him. No resentment, no bitterness, no envy from Moses. He had played his part to the full, and he was fulfilled. The crux of it is this: Moses recognized the immense grace of God to have been included in God's plan at all, and to have enjoyed all that he had experienced of God. And having realized that he was part of God's greater plan, and having placed all his trust in that plan, Moses was completely at peace about dying when he did. Let's quickly read about this in verses 5 and 6 of our passage. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. And the Lord buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was alone when he died. No one even knew where his body was buried. And yet, isn't this incredible? Moses didn't need anybody to be with him when he died, because God himself was with him. It was God who took Moses' mortal body in his eternal hands and buried the body. And it was God who carried Moses' immortal soul into his eternal presence. What more could Moses have asked for? Even in death, it was God's grace that Moses experienced. Moses had come to know and trust the greater plan of the God of grace. And so far from feeling cheated out of the promised land, Moses was entirely at peace with how everything turned out. Not necessarily because he understood God's plan, but because he trusted God's plan. The New Testament book of Hebrews, speaking of all Old Testament believers like Moses and Abraham, says in chapter 11 and verse 39, none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And Hebrews explains in great detail how Jesus is that something better that God had planned. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's eternal plan. In Jesus, God has come down to all of us. In Jesus, God climbed Mount Calvary, and there he was put to death for our sin. And in Jesus' resurrection, God reveals his incredible plan of grace, not to bury us, but to raise us from the dead. In Jesus' ascension, God shows us his plan for us to also go to him. And in Jesus sending us his Holy Spirit, God enters our lives in power to journey with every believer throughout our lifetime. This had always been God's greater plan, not to have a handful of chosen people living a temporary life in some earthly kingdom called the Promised Land, but through Jesus to make a way for every human being, including you and me, to become his chosen people under his glorious kingship in his eternal kingdom. Moses realized this, which is why he never felt cheated out of the promised land. Moses wasn't going to settle for the promised land when he knew that God had something far greater in store for him, an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 4 and 5. While in his day, Moses didn't yet have the knowledge of Jesus, Moses knew God. And knowing God as he did, the God who had shown himself to be a God of grace and rescue, Moses knew that God would never abandon him in death, that God had a greater plan that transcended this world, that God had something better in store for Moses and for us all. Years later, when Jesus was interrogated by the legalistic Pharisees about the greatest of all the laws of Moses, Jesus responded, "Love the Lord your God with everything you are, and love your neighbor equally to yourself." A paraphrase of Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. And this is exactly how Moses found his place in the greater plan of God. He gave himself to the composer, and he gave himself to the orchestra with him, so that many could be moved by the greater plan of God. Finding ourselves begins with us accepting that there is a greater plan of God that outlives us. When we accept this, we realize that life is not just about me getting what I want out of it. My life is part of a greater composition that's calling me to contribute by loving God firstly and also loving everyone in this life with me. God's greater plan has always been for us to be his people, in his kingdom, under his glorious rule for all eternity. God made this possible through Jesus. So to believe in Jesus is to accept God's greater plan. When we climb the Mount of Calvary and put our trust in Jesus, that's when the living God comes down to us, never to leave us again. That's when his grace forgives all our sin forever. That's when his Spirit enters our lives and powerfully enables us to become all that he created us to be, making us alive to him for all eternity. When we accept God's greater plan by putting our trust in Jesus, we can live full and meaningful lives of grace, even when life doesn't turn out the way we hoped or wanted. Lives that bear witness to the goodness of God and move other souls into God's glorious plan for us all, as we live out with all our hearts our contribution to God's glorious composition. And when, like Moses, we trust God's greater plan, we can accept our own death without fear or fight, knowing that Jesus already has us safely in his arms and is about to take us into a kingdom life far more glorious than anything we could have ever imagined on this earth. And when we get there, we will never feel cheated out of anything at all. Far from it. We will be so rejoicing for all eternity in the love and grace of God that moved to have us included in his eternal plan at all. Living life, but looking up, connected with Jesus, connected with one another. God bless you.